All right, this is May the 13th, Lecture 5 of Rashi, His World and the Origin of Ashkenazic Jews by Rabbi Lawrence Troster. And we're continuing and hopefully finishing up today his commentary to Genesis chapters 1 and 2. So we are on Genesis 2. And make sure you have a copy of the Tanakh in front of you with Genesis chapter 2 opened. And we got as far as the Genesis 2:4, and we continued through till to the notion of a mist, and 2:7 we talked about the gathering of the dust from the ground. So if we look at, we're up to, on our material, page 9, chapter, which is dealing with chapter 2, still on verse 7. Okay, and this is important because it talks about he has talked about the forming of the human from the earth, Adam from Adamah, but now there is a important point of him breathing life into this form that he creates, and this dual sort of act of creation. Whereas in Genesis 1, it's just let's make man in his image, and then it just says that he did it. In this one, there's something, because there's this two-step creation, it provides a considerable opening for Midrashic understanding. So is everybody's got the material, correct? Page 9? Okay, so first of all, just a reminder, it says in the Hebrew, the Lord God formed man from the dust of the earth. He blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man, or human, became a living being. And the breath of life is nishmat chayim. And he becomes a living creature, nefesh chaya. So you see the word nishama and the word nefesh, which later come to mean soul, but don't mean soul in the original context. And of course the word chayim, meaning life, and chaya, a living creature related to the same root as chayim. And chaya can refer to any living creature, but not plants. I mean, I'm talking about animals. And I think I mentioned the idea that nishama and nefesh and the other word that's often used, ruach, are all related to the words for wind and breath. The idea that wind is a motivating form of energy, to use a modern term, that wind moves things. And so that anything that moves is a nefesh chaya. Plants are not, because they don't move of their own volition. So just as a wind will move objects, so our internal wind, so to speak, allows us to move. And when it departs from us, we cease to move, and therefore we cease to be alive. So you have to see ruach/nishama nefesh as motivate, as a form of the biblical idea of what we would call energy. It's wind energy. And it comes from God, because in the beginning of Genesis it talks about the Ruach Elohim, which is translated as the Spirit of God often, but it can mean a wind from God, but it can also be, and it means both those things, but it can also mean the creative energy of God. You can look at it that way. So that's what's going on here in the biblical text. But Rashi, of course, is now heavily influenced by later Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism especially, and he's going to look at it within the context of that, which sees a separation between earthly matter and what we now more conventionally call the soul. So Suzanne, you want to read it? And he breathed into his nostrils.
He made him of earthly matter and of heavenly matter. The body of earthly matter, the soul of heavenly matter.
Right.
Because on the first day, heaven and earth were created. On the second day, he created the firmament for the heavenly beings. On the third day, he commanded, and let the dry land appear for the earthly beings. On the fourth day, he created luminaries for the heavenly beings. On the fifth day, he commanded, let the waters swarm for the earthly beings. On the sixth day, it became necessary to create for both the heavenly and the earthly beings. For if not, there would be jealousy in the creation, for these would exceed those by the creation of one day.
Okay, so here he's quoting from Genesis Rabbah pretty clearly. And notice he's making this distinction between earthly matter and heavenly matter, what we would call the material and the spiritual. And there is this sharp distinction between the two. In Rabbinic Judaism, because they have been influenced by Hellenistic civilization for hundreds of years before that, that in the rabbinic cosmology, you have earthly matter, and once you get above the lunar sphere, you have celestial matter, which is increasingly spiritual and subtle and non-material. So he sees how the human is a linking between these two kinds of matter. That the nephesh, the soul, as we now understand it, is a way in which non-material matter can be put into material matter. The question, of course, is, do animals have it? All right, so read the next one. A living soul, nefesh chaya.
Cattle and beasts were also called living souls, but this one of man is the most alive of them all, because he was additionally given intelligence and speech.
In other words, this shows this sharp, what philosophers call the ontological separation between humans and animals. That whereas we do have earthly matter, our bodies, there is something distinctive about our souls. Animals have a certain level of soul, but we have a higher kind of soul that allows us to have what we would call sentience and, of course, speech, which whatever we know now about the ways in which animals communicate and kind of, proto-language or whatever you want to talk about for certain kinds of animals, there is nonetheless a rather, sharp distinction between the way humans speak and the way animals communicate in any way. And so that's what's shown here. So he's reflecting very much a medieval idea. When you go to Maimonides and other medieval philosophers, they actually have sort of 4 different kinds of levels of soul. They in fact allow vegetable life a kind of lower, animating soul, being alive, and then they up it a bit for animals that move, and then they understood that some animals have an emotional aspect to them. Right? They can see that there's a higher level intelligence in some animals, but they preserve this highest level of soul for human beings. Again, there's sharp distinction. And Rashi is not reflecting that so systematically, that kind of philosophical approach, but nonetheless, here he is making this sharp distinction between humans and animals. Okay? And his criteria is intelligence and speech. The Midrash on which, there is a Midrash which, in fact, very much has the, what's the distinction between, why is the human like the upper beings, the Elyonim, and the lower beings, the Tachtonim, the lower beings? word tachtonim just comes from tachat, meaning the lower, but what's amusing is in modern Hebrew, tachtonim means underwear. Tachat is where we get tuchas from, actually, and it just means the lower part. Anyway, and there it delineates the fact that we are like lower beings in that we eat, we excrete, we propagate, and we die. And we are like the upper beings because we're bipedal, we stand upright, we have intelligence, we have speech, and we have peripheral vision. They claim animals don't have peripheral vision. So so now we're in verse 8.
Cows have their eyes on the side, and they very much have peripheral.
I know, but they didn't know that. In other words, they thought that only humans had peripheral vision. Yeah. So let's take a look. First of all, verse 8 now. The Lord God planted a garden in Eden in the east, and placed there the man whom he had formed. Okay, now he's going to first of all look at the word from the east. In Hebrew, mikedem. Suzanne, you want to do one more?
In the east of Eden, he planted the garden. Now, if you ask, it has already been stated above in 1:27, and he created man, and so forth.
In other words, why is it necessary to do all of this?
I saw in the Baraita of Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Rabbi Yossi the Galilean, concerning the 32 principles by which the Torah is expounded, and this is one of them, method 13. A general statement followed by a specific act. The latter constitutes a specific clarification of the first general statement.
Okay, so this is an attempt to understand the dual sources of creation. And so the question is, why is there two? And he is relying upon a set of there were different lists of hermeneutical principles that are in rabbinic literature, and this happens to be one of them. And the hermeneutical principle is called klal miprat, laprat. In other words, you start with a general, and then you can have, out of the general, you can have the specific instance. So this allows them to say there's no redundancies or repetitions. You also have the opposite principle, prat to klal, where you have a specific instance of something, but you can infer from that a general principle. That's, a lot of the laws where there's a very specific case listed, and then rabbinic literature sees a general principle out of it, like bal tashchit, don't destroy trees in wartime, becomes a general principles of not wanton destruction of anything. Okay? So here it's Genesis 1 is the general discussion, and now we're getting the details. Go on.
And he created man. This is a general statement. It left obscure whence he was created, and it left his deeds obscure, that is, how God created man. The text repeats and explains, quote, and the Lord God formed, etc. And he made the Garden of Eden grow for him, and he placed him in the Garden of Eden, and he caused a deep sleep to fall upon him. The listener may think that this is another story, but it is only the detailed account of the former. Likewise, in the case of the animal, Scripture repeats and writes, below verse 19, and the Lord God formed from the ground all the beasts of the field, in order to explain, and he brought them to man, to name them and to teach about the fowl, that they were created from the mud.
So there it is. Again, the idea that there's a general description of the creation of all animals in Genesis 1, and then you have a more detailed account of them because of the necessity to show how Adam, or the Adam at this point, is the one that names the various species. Okay, so this is, Rashi didn't invent this method of reconciliation, but it is an essential part of the homiletical the drash element of rabbinic interpretation of Bible. Rashi is presenting it as pshat. Okay, that's not going to be good enough for his grandson Rashbam and others necessarily. Okay, they're going to try and say, okay, let's not rely on that. Let's try and keep to the text itself to try and understand this. Okay, so let's see how we're going to go from here. So Muriel, you want to do the next one? First, we're going to read 2:9 in the Tanakh. And from the ground. This is on page 3, the bottom.
Okay. And from the ground the Lord God caused to grow every tree that was pleasing to the sight and good for food, with the tree of life in the middle of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and bad.
Now this, of course, again contradicts the order in Genesis 1, where the trees, the creation of the trees precede the creation of the human being. Okay. All right. So take a look at what Rashi says, and cause to sprout.
And cause to sprout. Scripture speaks about the garden from Genesis Rabbah 13:1.
Yeah.
In the midst of the garden, i.e. in the middle of the garden from Targum.
Yeah, now what he in effect is saying is that the description here is restricting it strictly to the Garden of Eden, that this is not talking about the general creation of plants. But of course in Genesis 2 it doesn't say anything further about that, does it? But he, can be argued he's maybe correct in this, that what you have here is only a discussion of the garden itself. Okay? All right, now let's take a look at verse 10. It says, a river issues from Eden to water the garden, and then it divides and becomes 4 branches. So the text says there's a primordial river that then breaks into 4 to form the 4 great rivers of the ancient world as understood by the authors of Genesis 2, okay, the ones that they know of. 3 of them we can pretty well identify, 1 we're not so sure about. But let's see how Rashi understands it. Okay. Pishon.
Pishon, this is the Nile, the river of Egypt. And because its waters are blessed, and they rise and water the land, it is called Pishon. Like
Habakkuk.
And their riders shall increase.
Skip the stuff in brackets. Another explanation.
Another explanation, it is called Pishon because causes flax to grow, as is stated in reference to Egypt, and those who work at flax shall be ashamed.
So the word Pishon comes from the Hebrew word for gusher.
Gusher?
Gusher, like gushing out. That's probably the origin of the Yiddish word pisher, but anyway, I'm not kidding. Maybe not, but anyway, the point is, he's taking 2 words that, when you look at them in context, are referring to Egypt, that have the same root. All right, pasha, meaning to increase, to gush, and also the word for flax, and it connects it to Egypt. So he's connecting Pishon with the Nile. Now the Nile's not called that later on in the Bible. There's a different name for the Nile. So whether it is the Nile or not, maybe not. Go on. Gihon.
Gihon, it's named thus because it flowed and roared, and its roaring was very great, like if an ox gore,
Yigach.
or he gores and goes along and roars.
His etymology here is probably incorrect. We're not really sure where Gihon is, but it may refer to the Gihon spring in Jerusalem. This may be a reference to the Gihon where the Shiloam pool is. Why? Because in eschatological texts like Ezekiel and Zechariah, a primordial river at the end of days will issue from the Temple Mount. Okay, the Gihon spring. So there is here, this is probably in the original text, a subtle reference to connecting the Temple Mount to the primordial rivers of Eden, and therefore the Temple Mount, in fact, is the Garden of Eden, the site of the Garden of Eden originally. There's all kinds of interesting stuff about this, but we really don't know where actually Gihon is. By the way, some people think that Pishon, in fact, refers to an actual river that may have existed in what we call Saudi Arabia at a time when there was it wasn't as dry, that there's evidence for an old riverbed. Somebody made this theory some years ago that there was a river in at the time that these texts might have been written. There may still have been, or there'd been a memory of a actual river that flowed through part of the Arabian Peninsula, but because of changing weather conditions, climate change, it dried out. Okay, read on, 2:14.
Tigris, thus called because its waters are sharp and light.
Okay, now, so what he's taking here is the word for Tigris is Chi-dekel. Okay, and this is the Tigris. Everybody agrees this is referring to the Tigris. So he's saying that the etymology of the word Chi-dekel comes from two words, Chad, meaning sharp, and light, meaning kal, meaning light. So you combine the two, and it's sharp water, or, sharp, light water, okay? So this is more of a folk etymology than probably, than a real one. So now we're on page 10. Euphrates.
Euphrates, thus called because its waters are fruitful and increase abundantly and make people healthy.
And this is prat. And he's making the connection of prat to pre, where we get increase and fruit from. Okay, now in the text it talks about them, and then there's a parenthetical, verse 12 talks about the gold, and then in verse 13 and 14 it talks about them, and it says of the Tigris that it flows east of Ashur. Okay, and the fourth is the Euphrates. Now, earlier it talks about the Gishon through the whole land of Cush, which is another reason why it would be connected to the Nile, since Cush is Ethiopia. Sudan, Ethiopia, that southern area is considered the land of Cush. But of course these two lands didn't exist. So why are they in the Torah? Well, we could say from modern perspective, just an anachronism, not a big deal, right? But look what Rashi says. Cush and Assyria.
Cush and Assyria, these did not exist as yet, and Scripture wrote their names based on the fact that they will exist in the future.
Okay, so the Torah is giving us a future reference of them, and now the phrase itself talks about the Tigris flows east of Ashur. Go on.
To the east of Assyria.
So there it is. In other words, that the Tigris flows east of Assyria, and then go on. That is the Euphrates.
That is the Euphrates, the most important of all of the rivers, because it is mentioned in conjunction with the land of Israel.
Yes, very often the Euphrates, which is the western one, is often mentioned in relationship to the borders of the land of Israel, meaning that the ideal borders of the land of Israel are from the Euphrates, which would put it up in Syria, past Damascus today. Something that probably never happened, not even during the time of David. But that the ideal borders of the land of Israel are from Euphrates in the northeast, all the way down to what we call El Arish in the Sinai Peninsula. Okay?
That would give Israel the water supply that it needed.
Well, it would give Israel a vast territory that it never inhabited. Okay? But of course, fundamentalists still look at this and say, Yeah, this is what we should. Okay, so let's go back to the text itself. We're on chapter 2, verse 15, and page 4 in the Tanakh. So Irma, why don't you read verses 15 to 17?
The Lord God took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to till it and tend it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden you are free to eat, but as for the tree of knowledge of good and bad, you must not eat it, for as soon as you eat of it, you shall die.
Okay, now, Rashi's not going to comment on much on this. He hasn't said anything about the tree of life, and he hasn't said anything yet about the tree of knowledge. He'll get to that, but he's leaving it aside for the moment, which I find interesting. But take a look at what he says on 2:15, Irma. This is on page 10 of our material.
He took him with pleasant words and enticed him to enter.
Now, the word vayikach would normally just say, feel like, God picked the guy up and put him in the garden, right? But Rashi wants to say, no, God doesn't act that way. God's going to do things in a nicer, menschlich way. So he took him with pleasant words. Kind of like, come on in, it's real nice in here, All right, so now take a look in 2:18. You want to read the original Irma down to the end of, let's read down to the end of verse 20.
The Lord God said, It is not good for man to be alone. I will make a fitting helper for him. And the Lord God formed out of the earth all the wild beasts and all the birds of the sky, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called each living creature, that would be its name. And the man gave, and the man gave names to all of the cattle, and to the birds of the sky, and to all the wild beasts. But for Adam no fitting helper was found. So the Lord God cast a deep sleep upon the man, and while he slept, he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh at that spot. And the Lord God fashioned the rib that he had taken from the man into a woman, and he brought her to the man. And the man said...
Okay, we'll stop there. So that's, this is the formation. And notice it begins with the idea that God somehow is, doing a monologue here, and that the human should not be alone. And he will create for him an ezer kenegdo, translated here as fitting helper, but that can be understood in a number of different ways. And notice what God, first of all, does. This is when the animals are created. Up until now, the garden's just got trees and plants in it that the human has to work at, but now there's all of these new creatures, and God brings them to the human to name them. But this is not good enough. The human, like the animals all have their mates, but the human does not. So this is where you have the secondary creation of the woman, right? Which we're all familiar with, that he has a sleep, he takes one of his ribs and out of his side, and he turns it into a woman, okay? And here, the word for the woman is isha. Okay, we'll get to that. So let's now look at what Rashi says, starting verse 2:18. We're in the...
It is not good, etc. Lest they, people, say, there are two dominions. The Holy One, blessed be He, is alone among the heavenly beings, and He has no mate. And this one man among the earthly creatures has no mate.
Now, this is kind of odd, because who are the people if there's no people? But he's saying the way in which people will read the creation story will make it sound like there are two gods. There's the God of the heavens and the God of the earth, because they are singular. And this he's picking up from Genesis Rabbah, which of course was, when Genesis Rabbah, some of the material goes back to, pre-Christian, before the Christianity became the, religion of the Roman Empire, when there's still pagans around, where there are still Manichaeans, who say that the earth is the creation of the demiurge, lower god, which they don't like because they don't like matter. So he's picking this idea up. Read the next one, a helpmate opposite him, because ezer kenegdo can mean exactly that, literally. An ezer, a helpful, kenegdo, opposite, meaning in front of almost. Go on.
If he is worthy, she will be a helpmate. If he is not worthy, she will be against him to fight him.
So taking the possibility that lenegdo can be a negative thing, right? If he's worthy, she'll be a good wife. If he's not worthy, she won't be. All right. Again, this is pure midrash. This is drash. This is not shot, obviously. Yeah.
Do they read this to mean that she will try to correct him if he is not worthy? She will be against him. She will try to correct him. And he'll have-
It could be that way. It could be that way, or she will become a shrew. Who knows? You know. I mean, it's trying. That word ezer kenegdo can mean a number of different ways to understand it. Here, as I said in our JPS, it refers to it as a fitting helper. All right. Go on. Let's do another one.
19, and God formed from the earth. His forming is identical with the making mentioned above. And God made the beasts of the earth, etc. But it comes here to explain that the fowl were created from the mud, because it stated above that they were created from the water. And here it states that they were created from the earth. It also teaches you here that at the time...
Okay, stop there. So this is a contradiction, because it would appear from Genesis 1 that the birds came out of the oceans, out of the water alone, and not the earth where the animals. And notice the word forming in the Hebrew is vayitzar, as opposed to the word asa, meaning to make. And he's saying they are equivalent of one another. And so how is he solving the difference between the birds coming out of the earth here and the water in Genesis 1?
Clever. Mud.
Mud! It's mud. Okay. All right. Go on. It also teaches you.
It also teaches you here that at the time of their forming, immediately on that day, he brought them to man to name them.
In other words, it just happens all this at the same moment. Where, again, in Genesis 1, they are formed, and then the human is formed. Here, the order has been flipped. Go on.
And in the words of the Adirah,
This Yitzirah
has the meaning of domination and conquest, like in Deuteronomy when you besiege a city, meaning that he subjugated them under man's dominion.
Now he's making a connection between the root for form, yatsar, and the word for besiege, tatsur. And so he's saying, in Genesis 1, it says that the human will have dominion over them. And so here he is connecting up that Genesis 1 dominion with here, saying the forming also has a sense. This, of course, has really nothing to do with the actual Hebrew. So again, this is a drash connecting up two similar sounding words. Go on.
And whatever the man called each living thing, transpose it and explain it. Every living creature to which man would give a name, that was to be its name forever.
What he's saying is that you really should, flip the order here. But it's interesting that humans humans are the ones that name the animals, and this is part of the notion of dominion, is the ability to name.
Yeah. This is one of the earliest children's stories I ever.
Oh yeah.
About Adam naming the animals.
Right.
And because he named them, he had control. When you name something, it's yours. But I remember it as a really small child reading this.
Do you remember how it ends, the Midrash, which he doesn't quote here?
I'm sure happily. It was a children's
No,
story.
God comes and says, what are you going to call me?
Oh.
There's a Midrash that, he doesn't quote it here, but there's a Midrash that says at the end of that, God comes and says, what will you call me? That's a really lovely Midrash that says, in effect, whatever we call God is human language, because there's only one time, there's only two names by which God actually reveals himself, which is Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh and Elohim. But aside from that, all the other ways in which we refer to God are ones that humans give him. So it's a very lovely Midrash about the power of naming and the importance of naming. And it's a cute thing to utilize for this idea that God language is human language, not something that God, that somehow is real in that sense, because how can you actually know what God is? Okay, we're going to give you a little bit more since you've got down to the woman. Go ahead. And the Lord God.
And the Lord God fashioned the rib. Yeah.
No, he caused a deep sleep.
Where am I?
2:21.
2:21. So the Lord God cast a deep sleep upon the man, and while he slept, he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh at that spot. And the Lord God fashioned the rib that he had taken from the man into a woman.
Okay, no, go back to the Rashi. And the Lord God caused a deep sleep.
And the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall. When he brought them the animals, he brought before him of every species, male and female. He, Adam, said, everyone has a mate, but I have no mate.
Meaning, the animals propagate, but I have no mate. Now, one of the things you should understand, the word for deep sleep there, tardema, is used elsewhere in the Torah to mean not normal sleep, almost like a trance. Okay, it's a special word. It's not used that often. So it's not a normal sleep. Go on. One of his sides.
Of his sides, like in Exodus, and for the side of the tabernacle. This coincides with what the rabbis, said. They were created with two faces.
So the word that is normally translated as rib means a side. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's, the idea that, the way our translation is translated as rib, which is probably correct, but it's a more general term for side, or very similar, right? And his proof for that is a text about the tabernacle, which says the side of the tabernacle. And he sees this, which we've seen already before in his commentary, that what you have is this double-faced creature, which they got from some, Greek ideas, and who knows where that comes from, that what you have, and this is the way to reconcile Genesis 1 with Genesis 2, where Genesis 1 says God created the human, male and female, created them, as a double-sexed creature with two faces, and that what you have is not the taking of a rib out of which the woman is built, which is what the obvious text is in the Torah, but rather this creature is now split into two halves, meaning its sides are now split apart. Go on. And he closed.
And he closed the place of the incision. And he slept and he took, so that he should not see the pieces of flesh from which she was created, lest she be repulsive to him.
So in other words, you don't want to see how it's done. Okay. Now this is read the next one. And he built. And the word here, that's exactly what the word is. Vayiven has the sense of building. Here it's, the translation says fashion, but the root bana can mean to build. So he's picking up on this notion that this verb is normally used for building something, like a building. So go ahead.
Yeah, he made her like a building. Okay, that's where we get the slang.
Yeah, exactly.
Broad at the bottom and narrow at the top, so that she can carry a fetus, like a storehouse of wheat, which is broad at the bottom and narrow at top, so that its burden should not weigh on its walls.
Well, there it is. Okay, so in other words, why is a woman broader in the bottom?
Yeah.
I mean, this is anatomically correct, right? So that she can carry a fetus, all right? And he's making the analogy to a storehouse where you can't make it, you want to make it to be solid. So it's interesting he does it. Read the next one.
And he built the side into a woman, literally to a woman, to become a woman, and Gideon made it into an ephod.
So that he's correct. In other words, it's not into, but the word can mean to, right? Mm-hmm. And the Lord fashioned the rib, they take it, to a woman, meaning like a woman. Okay. All right, Cal, do you want to pick it up in our Tanakh on verse 23? Then the man said,
"This one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for from man was she taken."
Keep reading.
"Hence a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, so that they become one flesh."
And the last verse of the chapter, which is really the beginning of chapter 3, but go ahead.
"The two of them were naked, the man and his wife, yet they felt no shame."
Okay, so you have in the original text this lovely little poem that has all kinds of interesting kind of literary things. Etzem me atzamai, right? Bone of my bone. Uvasar mi bisari, flesh of my flesh, sort of, this double word. And then this lovely etymology of why a man is called an ish and a woman is called an isha, meaning making an etymological connection between the word, that isha comes because it comes from ish. So it's a popular etymology to explain the story, to explain it in the context of the story that the woman is built out of a piece of the man. Okay, and then there's a proverb then that's quoted in verse 24, right? That a man leaves his father and mother and clings to. Davak can mean embrace. It can denote intimacy. And they become one flesh. This is a lovely little proverb that is put in here in the original. And then the fact, of course, that the two of them were naked. There was in the garden, no clothes and no sense of sexual shame. The reason why our translation sort of puts it almost immediately connected to the beginning of chapter 3, because the word for naked, arumim, is then connected by sound to the word arum, which the nachash, the serpent, shrewdness versus, in other words, you've got a homonym here between nakedness and shrewdness. Okay? All right. Okay, Cal, do you want to go to the Rashi? This time.
This teaches us that Adam came to all the animals and the beasts in search of a mate, but he was not satisfied until he found Eve. This one shall be called Isha because from Ish. One expression coincides with the other. In other words, the words Ish and the words Isha have the same root. From here is derived that the world was created with the holy tongue.
Okay, so in other words, this is an idea that the rabbis had, that the text of the Torah itself represents that when God speaks in biblical Hebrew, and that there's something, that the language of creation is Hebrew, and therefore this has enormous consequences in rabbinic literature, even before the rabbis. The idea of that Hebrew is somehow the primordial language of the world, and there's something special and therefore magical out of Hebrew, that Hebrew, because it is the actual language of God for creation, if you know how to use Hebrew correctly, you can replicate the creative power of God, especially if you use God's names. So this is why you have Hebrew on ancient amulets and ancient magic, and why it becomes, by Rashi's day already, a long tradition of Jackie, do you want to shut the doors, please? I don't think anybody else is coming. A long tradition of the manipulation of letters for mystical purposes, and I will say mystical / magical purposes. In other words, the line is not so sharply drawn in some circumstances.
What's that called? Is a word for that?
Not generally. I mean, gematria is the use of translating letters into numbers, but this is not that. That's part of it. In other words, gematria can be utilized as a tool. There can be non-magical uses of gematria, but gematria is one of the tools by which the transposition of letters into numbers, into magical numbers, or numbers back into letters can be utilized as part of this whole thing. And by Rashi's day, there was this significant tradition of this notion that the letters of the Torah can be manipulated for magical circumstances, and it goes back to Talmudic times. And that if you do it right, you can replicate the creative process of God. This is where the legend of the golem has its origin, right? Think about it. The golem is, you form this creature out of earth, and then by the proper manipulation of magical things, it becomes a kind of living creature. There are, the actual sources for this go back to the Talmud itself and rabbinic literature itself. First of all, the word golem is used in one set of Midrashim when it is describing the process of the creation of Adam, which they do by a very, much more detailed than Rashi, a step-by-step thing. And at one point, God takes the earth and does various things. And so at one point, the form of the human has been created. It refers to that form as a golem, meaning a something that has form but no life. And there's a famous text in Tractate, I think it's Tractate Chagiga, where again, these are very strange texts and they're very short, and the meaning of them has been argued, but it talks about how a couple of rabbis sat around studying the Sefer Yetzirah, the book of creation, and there is such a book called the Sefer Yetzirah, which comes from the early Middle Ages, which is all about letters and numbers and creation. Are the rabbis in the Talmud referring to the same book? Well, it's possible, some earlier version. And they said that they used to create, a calf before Shabbat, and they would eat it. And then followed another one where somebody creates some kind of, I would say, golem figure and shows up at another rabbi who recognizes this is not really a real human being and says, "Oh, you must have come from those magicians." He says, "Go back to your dust." So the origin of the golem legend is very old and very obscure. If you want to read about it, there's a whole long essay that late Gershom Scholem wrote about it, which was quite interesting. So Rashi knows of all of this, but he doesn't put any of it in here. I mean, sometimes there's a little bit of a hint. So the idea that the world was created with the holy tongue is part of that tradition. Okay? Yeah.
Is that why the Jews are hated?
No, it has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. The golem legend, the way we finally understand the golem legend, is actually a relatively late creation. First of all, the idea that it was Rabbi Loew of Prague did it is much later. The original person who supposedly created the golem was, in fact, a guy named Eliyahu Habal Shem of Chelm, interestingly enough, a 16th or 17th century rabbi. But it's felt that the creation of the golem was a ritual of initiation by a certain group of mystics in Ashkenaz in the 13th century. The Hasidei Ashkenaz may have had a ritual of initiation where they actually made this clay figure, and they went into what we would call a mystical trance, and in the trance they thought they actually had brought it to life. But the idea of the golem coming out of the synagogue in Prague and saving the people and then getting out of control, that's a 19th century romantic story based on a novel that somebody wrote.
Well,
Okay.
tomorrow night, one book on community, The Golem and the Jinni.
Yes,
will be
yes.
the book that the author will discuss.
Yeah, the 19th century version of the golem story became quite popular because of this novel. I forget who wrote it, but it also became was highly popularized because there was a silent movie based on it. And from I think it was from Germany, based on the golem legend. And of course, it's shown up since then in all kinds of modern Jewish literature. Michael Chabon used it in one of his books. What was the name of it? Really, that is his book I like the best, actually. It's all about people also write comic books and the origin of Superman stuff and everything like that. And you're right, I haven't read that novel yet, so which I've heard sort of pretty what?
It's kind of fun.
Yeah, I've read kind of mixed reviews of it, but it's one of these things I like to read. So you get this thing where the golem legend now has become incredibly this popularized thing. In fact, when my brother visited Prague some years ago, they sell little clay golems with Emmet written on their forehead, and he brought me one. I have it at home on my shelf. But it's like many things. There's a long and complicated history to this. So in Rashi's day, there was no golem legend the way we have it, but the idea that the Hebrew language could be used for magical, creative purposes, it's in the Talmud. It'd actually be interesting to go see what he says about it on his commentary to the Talmud. I should do that. Anyway, okay, read on. Therefore, a man shall leave.
Therefore a man shall leave. The divine spirit says this to prohibit forbidden unions to the no eyes.
Now, this is very interesting. The rabbis had this idea that there were, all right, the common thing is 7 laws. They're different lists. It's not all set, but commonly there's a belief that there were what was called the laws of the sons of Noah, meaning basic moral laws that are incumbent upon all human beings. This is before the giving of the Torah at Sinai. That there are mitzvot that are specific to the Jewish people, and then there are the laws that are incumbent on all of humanity. And they derive them from a number of sources, some of which are from the story of Adam and Eve. And one of them is, murder is prohibited, and one of them is forbidden sexual unions or sexual violence, depends how you interpret it. So that there's this kind of, and they derive it from this. Okay? So that's one of the interesting sort of halachic interpretations of what is obviously not a piece of law, but it's one that goes back to the rabbis. In other words, his reference to Sanhedrin 58a, if we were to go to Tractate Sanhedrin, where the laws of the sons of Noah are described, this is the verse that they use to utilize where is this written? And they interpret this verse to be the origin of the law of forbidden sexual unions and sexual violence. Okay, go on.
One flesh. The fetus is formed by them both, and there in the child their flesh becomes one.
So this is also an interesting point of what you might call rabbinic biology, right? What does the fetus get from the man, and what does the fetus get from the woman? And there's no systematic discussion of this, but it's interesting that in one place it says that the fetus gets the red parts from the woman, the blood, because of menstrual blood, and the white parts from the man, like the bones, because of semen is white. Okay, so Rashi's not giving us the details, but there's a midrash which says, there are three partners in creation. The woman gives the red parts, the man gives the white parts, and the soul comes from God. So he's alluding to that midrash, that the creation of a fetus gets, and again, he doesn't know anything about sperm and egg and doesn't know anything about genetics, but it's pretty obvious from that children look like their parents. So they must get something from their parents, and a child can get things from both parents, right? A child can look pretty much like the mother or pretty much like the father, but there's always some kind of mixing of characteristics between the father and the mother. And so this is how they try to explain it. I mean, they weren't stupid. They observed this very clearly in human generations. All right. Well, I'll read the last one.
But they were not ashamed, for they did not know the way of modesty, to distinguish between good and evil. And even though knowledge was granted him to call all the creatures names, he was not imbued with the evil inclination until he ate of the tree. And the evil inclination entered into him, and he knew the difference between good and evil.
Now, this is a very interesting statement. What in effect it says, that they had a form of knowledge and sentience, but the suggestion here is that the humans were primarily, at this point, only Yetzer Tov, which would, by the way, if that's the case, then it means they didn't know about sex, right? They weren't having sex in the garden, and therefore there was no way that they could propagate in the garden, which seems to contradict the little thing that Adam says. Okay, but nonetheless, notice what he says, that he only got the Yetzer Hara when he ate of the tree, and once, because he only knew about good. And if you don't know about evil, you don't know about the differences of morality. How do you know what is good and evil if you don't know the existence of evil? It's a very interesting moral conundrum, right? That without the existence of one, you can't know of the moral choice. So that in the garden, because he didn't know yet that there was evil, he didn't know about morality, and therefore he didn't know about modesty. They didn't know about modesty or anything that we would call common morality. This is a really interesting issue, isn't it? And it's one that even biblical scholars argue about exactly, what was the state of the human in the garden? Did they know about good and evil? I mean, they knew God told them not to eat, chapter 3, don't do it or you're going to die, right? God tells them something that tries to sort of tell them, the notion of command, that there is some kind of, moral command. But what exactly did they know? Did they know about the existence of death? They knew the word. If you know the word, do you know the concept?
How do you know they knew the word?
Because that's what
God
says you will die if you eat it. And Eve repeats it to the snake, right? That if we eat it, we're going to die. Surely die. Not even just die, but definitely die, which of course doesn't happen, interestingly enough. At least not immediately. So that's another issue of, was there death in the garden? Were the first humans, in fact, immortal until they ate from the tree? This opens up, there's a lot of ambiguity in these stories. This is from the J source. And, you read through modern biblical commentaries, critical commentaries like the JPS commentary or Robert Alter or others, you'll see that the text seems almost intentionally to be ambiguous. Yeah, Jackie.
Yeah, it just brought to mind the fact that how you tell a story to sort of
induce people to ask questions, because the one thing thinking maybe this is it, yes, this is the story now, you think about it, and what do you come up with,
It's very likely. Or that they're dealing with this primordial time, which is so far in the past. They're in effect saying there's so much we just cannot say definitely. I think when you get to the accounts of the revelation at Mount Sinai, it's very clear that a lot of the sources are in effect saying what happened there we cannot fully be described. And that's true of any time when there's a real close encounter with God. The language is often incredibly ambiguous and open to multiple interpretations. And people like, Robert Alter and other modern literary analysts of the Bible say that's intentional. How can you describe the undescribable? Well, you don't. You don't fully describe it. You leave it open to the potential for, multiple interpretations. And that's why we like reading this stuff. Okay, anybody have any other questions or comments about his commentary to Genesis 1 or 2? Did you like it? Wasn't it interesting? Okay, so in answer to your requests, we're going to now look at the Akeda.
I was just going to say,
Yeah.
another comment. Coming through all these things, I'm thinking about how many times I have heard those explanations, and people don't say, oh, this is what Rashi said. It's accepted that this is a well-known, this is what it is.
It's because of Rashi they're well known. I mean, he is being incredibly selective as to which midrashim he chooses. Okay, that's the other thing you need to realize. He is selective. He doesn't always quote it in full, so he is being extremely careful about, how he chooses to present the midrash. But you're right, because he puts them in there, these are the ones that most people have heard of, even if they've never studied Rashi.
But, rabbis, people who have the knowledge, they just repeat these things, and because this is, as not that it's coming from somebody like Rashi who said it, but this is the explanation.
Exactly. And I think that what's interesting is there is no the explanation. And especially if you, go to modern sources, you can see that there's a lot of places where looking at it from a modern analysis, which has all kinds of tools that Rashi didn't have, he's wrong. Okay, and of course this issue of when is he saying something that is attempts to be pshat, and when is he using drash and claims it's pshat. And that's where if we were to go to Ibn Ezra or to Rashbam on these same verses, we would see very different commentaries, because they're not going to quote very much, if any, midrashim. They are going to really try and stick to the text as it is and try to explain it in that way. Okay? And if there was an easy way for me to, cut and paste Rashbam in English or Ibn Ezra, I would, but it isn't so easy. As I said, the big JPS, series on quoting all these things, they decided to leave Genesis for the last. So they just published Deuteronomy, but they don't have Genesis yet. So anyway, but let's take a look at one of course, the most important stories that we consider in the Torah, the Akeda, the binding of Isaac. So let's go to chapter 22 of Genesis, which is on page 39. And Jackie, I think it's your turn. Suzanne, I had to leave early. And why don't you read verses 1 to 5? This is on page 39 of the Tanakh.
Chapter 22, right?
Yep.
Sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, Abraham, and he answered, Here I am. And he said, Take your son, your favored one, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on the one of the height.
on one of the heights that I will point out to you. So early the next morning, Abraham saddled his ass and took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. He split the wood for the burnt offering, and he set out for the place of which God had told him. And on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his servants, "You stay here with the ass. The boy and I will go up there. We will worship, and we will return to you."
Okay, so a couple of interesting points that that will come out in the translation. Sometime afterwards literally means after these things. And the word for things, devarim, can also mean words. Okay, so that's an important point. The other thing is that our translation doesn't, in verse 2, does not reflect the actual order of the Hebrew. This is where I don't like it. It actually says, "And he said, take now," or please take, kachna is a kind of pleading, "your son, your only one, whom you love," and then you can translate it as even Isaac, "and go out, lech lecha, to the land of Moriah, and offer him up there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will speak to you of." Okay, that's a more literal translation. And notice it's take your son, your favorite one, the one whom you love, Isaac. Now, from a literary perspective, and this is why Robert Alter translates it closer to the actual text, there's a real sense of drama here, as if God is almost playing with Abraham's emotions to not put Isaac's name until the very end, as if Abraham could hang upon this, that maybe it's not Isaac. And as you will see, the Midrash, picking up on the original Hebrew, turns this into something quite fascinating, because what is one of the most difficult aspects of this story, do you think?
That Abraham would do it.
No, that Isaac was also supposed. How would he be able to have a great nation if Isaac doesn't propagate?
Yeah, and also the fact that Abraham says nothing.
Yeah.
Okay, and notice also at the beginning the word test. This is a really critical point. What does that mean? We're not talking here about a philosophical analysis that says, wait a minute, God already knows what he's going to do, so why does he do it? This kind of circular argument. If God knows what the end of the test is, how can God do a test? Is it really a test? Rashi's not going to get into that. But the point is, why does God do this? Why Abraham doesn't say anything? Because in the previous chapters, what did Abraham do? He argued for Sodom and Gomorrah, a terrible place, and yet he automatically goes and does what God says. This is one of these things that is difficult for the modern mind to grasp, and how to interpret Abraham's actions. Yeah.
One word, obedient.
But why was he so disobedient when it came to Sodom and Gomorrah? And for his own son, he couldn't say, wait a minute, how am I supposed to have progeny if you want me to kill off? Isn't this a contradiction, God, to what you promised me? All right? And there's been some great modern interpretations of this, poetry that has been written about this, Israeli poetry that is connected up with fathers sending sons off to war, to the army. Leonard Cohen wrote a beautiful piece on this about about sending old people sending children off to fight for them, and therefore he wrote it during the Vietnam War, the horrible nature of war. So there's been some great modern stuff, and of course Kierkegaard used this in his concept of, the leap of faith, right? That even though God asks Abraham to do something that is patently immoral and absurd, he does it anyway as this great leap of faith over the abyss of meaninglessness. So let's see how Rashi understands this. Remember, after these things can mean after these words. Okay, Jackie, do you want to begin reading? This is on page 1. Everybody got it? It says lecture 4, the material.
Which words? I'm sorry, which words?
Vayehi
If you read
achar hadvarim ha'ela.
If you read it to be after these words,
Yeah.
which words is it referring to?
Well, that's the problem. We don't know.
Something that happened before?
Yeah, well, I mean, it could be what happened in the previous chapter where Abraham has this problem with Avimelech, the head of the Philistines, and they're arguing over water. It could be just that. I mean, it could just be after that happened, this happened. But it could mean something else. Okay, go ahead.
After these things, some of our sages say that this happened after the word translation devarim as words of Satan, who was accusing and saying, of every feast that Abraham made, he did not sacrifice before you one bull or one ram. He, God, said to him, does he do anything but for his son? Yet if I were to say to him, sacrifice him for me, he would not withhold him. And some say, after the words of Ishmael, who was boasting to Isaac that he was circumcised at the age of 13, and he did not protest, Isaac said to him, with one organ you intimidate me. Intimidate me? If the Holy One, blessed be he, said to me, sacrifice yourself before me, I would not hold that.
So these are two famous Midrashim. The words are the words between Satan and God. Now remember, Satan is the accuser who is always trying to show the bad side of people's actions. And also, by the time of the rabbis, he has become a tempter. So, Satan doing his accusations is referring back to chapter 21, verse 8, that when it says, the child grew up and was weaned, and Abraham held a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. And according to Satan, Abraham offered no sacrifices to God to thanks for him. And God says, oh, all right, you think he does anything but for his son? You think the only reason why he's, obedient to me because of his son? If I were to say to him, sacrifice your son, he would not withhold him for me. And Satan basically says, okay, prove it. This is Job, right? This is picking up what's in the role of Satan in the book of Job and applying it to another good man. Is the man's goodness based upon self-interest, or does he, in fact, do something completely because of the obedience to God? And so Satan is egging God on, like in the beginning of the book of Job, to prove that Abraham is truly pious. And God says, okay, we'll take that bet. If I were to tell him to sacrifice his son, he'd do it. Which, by the way, helps with the notion of test. And why, of course, God will stop him, because he's gotten to the point where he knows that he's willing to do it. Okay, so that's one midrash. The second midrash is really interesting, okay? Meaning it was Ishmael. That in the midrash, Ishmael and Isaac are always at odds with each other. Whereas in the Torah itself, they never really meet, or like there's never real discussion of their relationship, right? But Ishmael is the firstborn. And he gets his circumcision is at age 13, which is where Muslims get it from. And he's saying, hey, look, you think you're so great, Isaac? You were only 8 days old. You didn't feel anything. I got circumcised at age 13, and I didn't protest. Took it like a man. And Isaac said to him, with one little organ, you intimidate me? right? If God said to me, sacrifice yourself before me, I would not hold back. So what does this say about Isaac's role in the Akedah, interestingly enough?
He's showing his devotion.
He's an active participant.
Exactly. That Isaac could have said, what? You're going to try and kill me? I'm getting the hell out of here. Right? You can't do that to me, Father. I refuse to participate. But the text suggests that Isaac was a willing participant. He doesn't struggle. You know, he figures out what's going on fairly early on, and he accepts it. So Isaac becomes whereas in the text, it's only alluding to the fact, obliquely, that Isaac is a willing participant. Here, in this strain of the Midrash, he's an active participant. Now, the fact that he has to be tied up, there's another strain of Midrash that said he went along with it, but he wasn't happy about it. Okay? In other words, he didn't want to agree to it, and that's why he had to be tied up. He tells his father in this other Midrashic stream, tie me up in case I struggle, and the knife goes incorrectly, and I become a treif sacrifice. Because if the animal struggles and the knife slits incorrectly, it's no good. And this is true of, kosher slaying, by the way. It's one of the reasons why apparently they would drug the animals. According to rabbinic tradition, they would feed the animals drugs, narcotics of some sort to calm them down before they were sacrificed. By the way, they also did that to, according to the rabbis' rules of capital punishment, they would do that to the criminals who were going to be put to death. This is alluding to there are two streams of Midrash on the Akedah. One where Isaac and Abraham are happy participants, ready to go. And the others, they're not. They do it, but they really don't want to do it. Interestingly enough, in the Gospels, two of the Gospels, Jesus is a willing participant in his own death, and two, he's not. Reflecting the Midrashic, the background that the crucifixion stories are based upon the stories of the Akedah. There's a literary connection between the two of them. Okay, read on. Hineni, here I am.
Here I am. This is the reply of the pious. It is an expression of humility and an expression of readiness.
And he's right. There's only a very small number of times in the entire Tanakh where somebody says, Hineni. I am ready to do it. This is one of them. So he's absolutely correct in that. Go on.
Please take Hebrew
Kachna.
Kachna is only an expression of a request. He, God, said to him, I beg of you, pass this test for me so that the people will not say that the first one's test had no substance.
This is seen in the Midrash as the end of 10 tests that Abraham has put through his life to test his loyalty to God. And what's the first test? Lech lecha, go out from your land. Notice here, this is the last time that God speaks. The Akedah is the last time God speaks to Abraham. Lech lecha. It's a link to the very beginning. So the rabbis picked up on this very clearly, that this is referred to as, Shalom Spiegel wrote a book called The 10th Trial, where he discusses a lot about the origin of the Midrashim about Isaac and the Akedah. So this is the first time God uses the word na, which is an untranslatable word, meaning a pleading word, sometimes translated as please or I beg of you. It's added to a verb. And so here it's as if God is not coming down and thundering, but is saying, please do this. It's very unusual that God actually uses that here, That's the reason why Rashi picks up on it.
When he asked for the healing of Miriam, isn't it what he says?
Rafana,
Please heal her.
please heal her. Right. Okay, go on. Your son.
Your son, he, Abraham, said to him, I have 2 sons. And he, God, said to him, your only one. And he said to him, this one is the only son of his mother, and that one is the only son of his mother. He said to him, whom you love? He said to him, I love them both. He said to Isaac, He said to him, Isaac. Why did he not disclose this to him in the beginning, in order not to confuse him suddenly, lest his mind become distracted and bewildered, and also to endear the commandment to him, and to reward him for each and every expression.
Now, the first part of this is this amazing midrash that turns. Remember how I emphasized what the Hebrew says, that there's this growing sense of drama, this painful drama. Take your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac. The midrash can't stand the silence. They can't stand the fact that Abraham says nothing. So they turn it into this funny dialogue between God, where Abraham's playing dumb intentionally. And in a certain sense, he's replicating his argument. He's arguing with God. Right? Because Abraham's silence is so inhuman to us. Because of a parent not saying, what? What do you want? So they turn it into this remarkable, because the sequence is the way it is. Take your son. I have 2 sons. Your only son. Well, this son is the only one of his mother, and this son's the only one of his mother. Whom you love. I love both of them. Isaac. It's a great midrash. I love that midrash. Because it makes Abraham more human again. And makes him play it out. What's only implied in the original Hebrew. His feigned ignorance. He knows what's coming. But he's playing it out anyway. Okay? All right. Read on. The land of Moriah.
The land of Moriah, Jerusalem, and so on in 2 Chronicles, to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. And our sages explained that it is called Moriah because from there religious instruction
Hora'ah
goes forth to Israel. Onkelos rendered it the land of service, as alluding to the service of the incense, which contained myrrh.
More.
Is phonetically similar to Moriah, spikenard, and other spices.
Okay, so Onkelos is trying to connect it up. In other words, the Torah itself, okay, connects it up to Jerusalem, but obliquely, okay? In other words, if you take a look on page 40, verse 14, it says, Abraham named that site Adonai Yireh, meaning the Lord will see, hence the present saying, on the mount of the Lord there is vision. It's pretty obvious from the original text that they are linking it up to Jerusalem and Mount Moriah, because they're taking the word Moriah and the word for vision or seeing as being the common root. So when Rashi quotes First Chronicles is a Second Temple period text, it's very clear that by the early Second Temple period, they had connected up the Mount Moriah of the Akedah story with the Temple Mount. Okay? Then he gives Onkelos, doing this kind of weird etymological connection between the spice sacrifice and Moriah and more. Okay?
Bring him up. He did not say to him, slaughter him, because the Holy One, blessed be he, did not wish to slaughter him, but to bring him up to the mountain, to prepare him for a burnt offering. And as soon as he brought him up to the mountain, he said to him, take him down.
Now, the word they're referring to here is, in our text in verse 2, v'ha'alehu.
I'm sorry.
V'ha'alehu, which can mean, the word Allah means go up, but it also is the verb that is used for making an offering. It's one of the verbs used for make a sacrifice, because the word for whole burnt offering is olah, meaning all of the smoke that goes up. So Rashi is understanding it as not offer him as a sacrifice, but bring him up, which is, another way to translate it. Bring him up to the mountain for a burnt offering. And so the Rashi is in effect saying that there's a hint here that he was never meant to be a sacrifice, because as soon as he brought him up, it says, take him down. Okay, go on. One of the mountains.
One of the mountains, the Holy One, blessed be he, makes the righteous wonder, other additions make the righteous wait, and only afterwards disclose to them his intentions. And all this is in order to increase their reward, like to the land that I will show you, and likewise concerning Jonah, and proclaim unto it the proclamation.
Okay, so what is he saying here? How long did it take him to get to the Moriah? 3 days. In other words, he didn't say, build an altar here, wherever you are, and do it right away. He's saying, go to this mountain that's a 3-day journey away and do it there. So, which of course is part of the painful nature of the story, that Abraham's got to schlep there for 3 days,
Knowing what's coming.
and so why does God make the righteous wait? We might say this is really not a nice thing, but it's to increase their reward. That's what he's saying. Anybody have any final questions so far? Okay, so we will next week continue and finish the Akedah, and then we will move on to the book of Job, which I'm going to give you copies of, so if you want to look it over beforehand. Just the first 2 chapters, because of that's the narrative beginning of the story, which has some interesting comments, and then when we finish that, we will go on to looking at Rashi's Talmud commentary. I'll talk about it, and we'll look at examples of it. It's a little more difficult to study as a text, and then we'll hopefully have some time for looking at something else, maybe one of his responsa, maybe some of his, if possible, his liturgical stuff, but finally, hopefully to talk a bit